Welcome back to our channel. Today we explore the story of a saint whom the world once called a lunatic. Her own sisters threw holy water in her face, convinced she was possessed by the devil. But Margaret Mary Alacoque wasn't crazy. She was burning. For 17 years she lived with a secret wound in her chest, a physical scar from a divine encounter. It was a wound that seared her flesh with the relentless fire of Christ, transforming her very heartbeat into a rhythm of agony and ecstasy. She didn't just pray to the Lord, she was incinerated by Him, enduring a living martyrdom that no medicine could cure. But before she could endure the fire of divine love, she had to survive the crushing weight of human cruelty. The year was 1647. In the French village of Verozvres, the Alacoque family lived in the comfortable glow of middle-class stability provided by Claude Alacoque, a royal notary. But in 1655, this pillar collapsed. Claude died suddenly, plunging his widow and 8-year-old Margaret into a socio-economic nightmare. Control of the estate was seized by a cruel relative, Toussaint Alacoque, who instantly reduced the rightful owners to prisoners in their own home, locked away from their own food and wine, forced to beg for bread and permission to even walk in the garden. Margaret learned a harsh truth. Safety is an illusion. Then the darkness deepened. At the age of 9, Margaret's body betrayed her. She succumbed to a systemic collapse that left her paralyzed for 4 agonizing years. Confined to a bed of stale linens, treated as a useless eater by her miserly relatives, she spent 48 months staring at the crucifix. She began to understand suffering not as an accident, but as a language, a way to communicate with the man on the cross. Yet the desire to run, to stop being a burden to her weeping mother, grew unbearable. Desperation drove her to make a transaction. It was not a prayer. It was a contract negotiation. In the solitude of her sick room, Margaret whispered a vow to the Virgin Mary. "If you give me back my legs, I will give you my life. I will become a nun." The response was terrifyingly efficient. The paralysis vanished instantly. She stood up free from the bed, but the heavy door of her future had just locked shut. She was 9 years old, and she belonged to heaven. But recovery brought amnesia. As Margaret blossomed into a striking young woman, the memory of the sickbed was replaced by the carnival of vanity. She discovered the thrill of social gatherings, the allure of fashion, and the intoxicating rustle of ribbons. She loved the way young men looked at her with admiration. Her mother, desperate to escape their poverty, weaponized this beauty, pleading with Margaret to marry well and save them both. Torn between her secret blood oath and the immediate need to protect her mother, Margaret tried to drown her conscience in the noise of the ballroom. She danced and laughed, but every night she returned home with a cold dread in her stomach, the haunting sense that she was cheating on a divine lover she had yet to meet. The turning point came after a night of carnival. Margaret had returned home late, dressed in her finest costume, her mind buzzing with the music and the flattery of the evening. She felt, for a moment, like she belonged to the world. She went to her room, intending to sleep, but as she began to undress, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew heavy. The silence became deafening. In her mind's eye, or perhaps in the room itself, she saw Him. It was not the glorious Christ. It was the ex homo. It was Jesus, fresh from the scourging at the pillar. He was stripped naked, his flesh torn to ribbons by Roman whips, blood pooling at his feet. He held a rope in his hand, the rope of his captors. He did not scream at her. He simply looked at her with eyes of devastating sadness. And then she heard the voice in her soul, clearer than any spoken word. "Will you leave me for the world, when I have suffered this for you?" The contrast was grotesque. There she stood in her silks and ribbons, flushed with vanity and life, and there he stood, a mass of wounds and death. The realization shattered her. She saw her vanity not as a harmless phase, but as a betrayal of the one who had saved her from paralysis. She realized that her health, her legs, her very life were on loan from him, and she was using them to dance away from him. She looked at the ribbons in her hands, the symbols of her freedom and her mother's hope, and they felt like ashes. Margaret collapsed in tears. That night, the girl who loved the carnival died. In her place, a zealot was born. The morning after her vision, Margaret waged war on her body with ropes and planks, embracing pain to fight the world's comfort. Her family's pressure to marry turned the household into a battlefield until a Franciscan priest intervened, warning them not to fight against God. On May 25, 1671, she entered the Visitation Convent, expecting a sanctuary of extreme suffering. Instead, she found a regime of crushing moderation. Her private penances were forbidden, her clumsiness mocked, and her mystical trances mistaken for laziness. To break her will, she was assigned to the infirmary. Despite a visceral phobia of gore, she forced herself to clean rotting wounds, learning that love was not a feeling, but a steel-hard act of will. But the greatest test was yet to come. Her profession, the final vows that would bind her to the order forever, was delayed. The superiors were unsure of her. She was too strange, too intense, too mystical in a way that smelled of trouble. For a year, she lived in the limbo of the novitiate, watching others take their vows while she was held back, a spiritual remedial student. The rejection stung her pride, but it also terrified her soul. What if she was sent away? What if she was returned to the world, to the noise and the vanity she had fled? The thought was unbearable. In her desperation, she retreated deeper into the chapel, spending every spare second before the Eucharist, begging not for acceptance by the nuns, but for possession by God. It was during this period of delay and doubt that the supernatural phenomena began to escalate from whispers to physical sensations. She began to feel a presence always beside her, so tangible she would sometimes turn her head expecting to see a physical body. It was Jesus, she claimed, but not as a distant deity. He was there as a jealous, demanding lover. He began to dictate her actions, correcting her when she faltered, rebuking her when she sought comfort in human conversation. One day, after she had spent recreation time laughing and talking with the other novices, enjoying a rare moment of human connection, she returned to her cell to find the presence waiting for her, heavy and cold. He told her that he did not tolerate rivals. He wanted her silence. He wanted her attention to be fixed solely on him. This possessiveness might sound abusive to a modern ear, but to Margaret, it was the confirmation she craved. It meant he wanted her. It meant she was not forgotten. On November 6, 1672, after months of agonizing delays, the superiors finally relented. Margaret Mary Alacoque was permitted to make her final profession. She stood before the altar, the smell of incense thick in the air, and pronounced the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience until death. But privately, she made a fourth vow, written in her own blood. In a moment of secret drama that would have scandalized her sisters, she had pricked her finger and written the name of Jesus on a piece of paper, signing over her will, her heart, and her eternal soul to him. It was a contract signed in the vital fluid of her life. She carried this paper over her heart, a hidden talisman of her total surrender. With her vows spoken, the final barrier between her and the divine fire was removed. She was now his property, legally and spiritually. The surgery could begin. The year 1673 arrived, bringing with it a winter that froze the water in the fonts and turned the stone floors of the convent into slabs of ice. Margaret's life had settled into a rhythm of external incompetence and internal inferno. She continued to annoy the sisters with her slowness, but inside she was being consumed. The presence was no longer just beside her, it was beginning to invade her. She felt a heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, a burning sensation that started in her heart and radiated outward, making her flush and sweat even in the freezing chapel. The other nuns noticed her strange physiology, how she would emerge from prayer with her face red and burning, her eyes glassy and unfocused, stumbling as if drunk. They whispered that she was physically ill, or perhaps mentally unstable, prone to fits of hysteria. They did not know that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into a volcano. The climax of this spiritual courtship occurred on December 27, 1673, the feast of Saint John the Evangelist, the disciple who had famously rested his head on the chest of Jesus at the Last Supper. The symbolism was not accidental. Margaret entered the chapel late in the afternoon. The winter sun was already fading, casting long bruised shadows across the nave. The sanctuary lamp flickered red in the gloom, the only sign of life in the silent church. Margaret knelt before the grille that separated the nuns from the altar, her knees finding the familiar grooves in the wood. She closed her eyes, intending to pray the office, but the words died in her throat. The silence of the chapel suddenly deepened, becoming heavy, pressing against her skin like deep water. The ambient sounds of the convent, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the wind in the eaves, ceased abruptly. She opened her eyes, and the world she knew had dissolved. The altar, the grille, the stone walls, all of it faded into a gray mist, and in the center of that mist, he appeared. It was Jesus, but not the broken victim of her earlier vision. This was the Lord of glory, yet he was terrifyingly accessible. He did not hover in the clouds. He stood directly before her, immense and radiating a heat that she could feel on her skin. But her eyes were drawn immediately to his chest. His tunic was open, and there, suspended in the cavity of his rib cage, was his heart. It was not a static organ. It was alive, beating with a rhythm that thumped in Margaret's own ears. It was wreathed in flames that were so bright they hurt her eyes, and surmounting the heart was a cross planted in the flesh. Encircling it was a crown of thorns, puncturing the vessels, causing drops of blood to trickle down into the flames, where they hissed and evaporated. Margaret was paralyzed, not by illness this time, but by awe. She tried to look away, but the sight held her. She felt her own heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape a cage. Jesus spoke, and his voice was the sound of many waters, resonating in the marrow of her bones. "My divine heart is so passionately in love with men," he said, the words searing into her mind, "that it can no longer contain within itself the flames of its burning charity. It must pour them out through you, through her, the clumsy nun, the one who dropped plates, the one who gagged at the smell of sickness." The absurdity of the choice was not lost on her, even in her ecstasy. Then came the moment of violation and consecration. In the vision, Jesus moved closer. The heat became unbearable. He reached out a hand scarred by the nail, and reached into Margaret's chest. She gasped, her body arching in a phantom pain that felt more real than any physical wound. She felt her heart being extracted, pulled from its moorings of vein and artery. She watched, dissociated with shock, as he held her small, trembling heart in his hand. It looked insignificant, a pale, weak thing compared to the furnace burning in his chest. With a deliberate, solemn motion, he placed her heart inside his own. Margaret watched as her heart was swallowed by the divine fire. It did not burn up. It was transformed. It became a tiny atom of flame, glowing with a reflected light, pulsing in rhythm with his great heart. For a moment, she was literally inside God. The intimacy was absolute. It was a fusion of distinct entities, a marriage of blood and fire. Then he withdrew it. He pulled her heart, now a burning ember, from the furnace of his chest and reached back into hers. He shoved it back into her body. The sensation was agonizing. It was as if she had swallowed a live coal. The wound in her side closed, but the pain remained, a sharp, stabbing ache in her left side that would never, ever leave her. It was a physical reminder, a scar of the encounter. "Behold," he whispered, "a precious pledge of my love enclosing in your side a little spark of its glowing flames, that it may serve you for a heart and consume you to the last moment." The vision faded. The gray mist evaporated. The stone walls of the chapel returned. The sanctuary lamp flickered. Margaret was lying on the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling violently, clutching her left side where the phantom wound burned with a very real agony. She was sweating profusely, her habit damp against her skin, despite the freezing temperature of the room. She tried to stand, but her legs refused to hold her. She was exhausted, drained of every ounce of strength. Yet her mind was racing with a clarity she had never known. She knew with terrifying certainty that her life was over. The Margaret Mary who worried about dropping plates, the Margaret Mary who feared the judgment of her sisters, was dead. She was now a vessel, a container for something too hot for the human frame to hold. She had to tell someone. She had to explain that the God of the universe had just consecrated her heart as an instrument. But as she dragged herself up from the floor, leaning against the cold stone pillar for support, she heard the bell ringing for the evening meal. The mundane reality of the convent crashed back in. She had to go to the refectory. She had to sit quietly. She had to eat bread and soup while her insides were on fire. She stumbled out of the chapel and into the corridor, her face pale, her eyes wild. She passed a sister who was hurrying the other way. The sister stopped, looking at Margaret's disheveled appearance with a frown. "Sister Margaret," the nun chided, "fix your veil. You look like you've been wrestling with a ghost." Margaret didn't answer. She couldn't. How could she explain that she hadn't wrestled a ghost, but had been opened by God? She lowered her head, hiding the fire in her eyes, and walked toward the dining hall, the pain in her side throbbing with every beat of her new, burning heart. She sat at the long wooden table surrounded by the clinking of spoons and the murmur of grace, feeling like an alien species. She harbored a revelation that would either sanctify the world or destroy her completely. She harbored a revelation that would either sanctify the world or destroy her completely. This internal fire soon manifested externally as the Friday fever, a violent trembling that alienated the community further. Instead of seeing a mystic, they saw a broken cog. The hostility escalated from whispers to brutal tests, holy water thrown in her face to check for demons, and orders to consume rotting food to prove her obedience. Even Mother de Saumaise, usually practical, dismissed the visions as delusions born of starvation and pride, ordering her to stop her theatrics. Driven to the edge of sanity by this mockery, Margaret committed a desperate act. In the solitude of her cell, she took a knife and carved the name of Jesus directly into her chest. She needed to feel the ownership physically. When the fresh wounds were discovered, the superior was appalled, confiscating the knife and placing Margaret under strict surveillance. The whispers in the corridor changed from visionary to lunatic. Margaret retreated into a shell of silence. She had tried to prove her love, and it had been called a sin. She began to doubt her own sanity. Was she crazy? Was this the devil? The isolation was now total. She was trapped in a hall of mirrors, unable to trust her own mind, unable to trust her sisters, with only the burning pain in her side as a constant, confusing companion. She prayed for death. She prayed for the earth to open and swallow her and her burning heart. But Providence, it seemed, enjoyed dramatic timing. In late February of 1675, a ripple of excitement went through the convent. The Jesuit community in Paray-le-Monial was receiving a new superior. The Jesuits were the intellectual heavyweights of the church, the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, men of immense learning, rigorous logic, and spiritual discernment. They were not easily impressed by weeping nuns or country miracles. The man arriving was Father Claude de la Colombière. On paper, his assignment to the sleepy backwater of Paray seemed like a demotion. Claude was a rising star. He was young, brilliant, handsome, and possessed a charisma that had made him a favorite in the salons of Paris. He had tutored the sons of Colbert, the king's powerful minister. He was destined for court, for greatness, for the pulpit of cathedrals. To send him to a small town in Burgundy to look after a house of nuns and a small college seemed a waste of talent. But in the economy of heaven, it was a precision strike. Father Claude arrived in Paray with a reputation that preceded him. He was known for his discernment of spirits, a theological gift that allowed a priest to look into the soul of a penitent and distinguish between mental illness, demonic deception, and genuine grace. He was a hunter of souls, and he had unknowingly walked into the territory of a very large quarry. A few days after his arrival, Father Claude came to the Visitation Convent to say Mass and preach a conference to the sisters. Margaret Mary sat in the back of the chapel, her head down, trying to make herself invisible. She was exhausted, her spirit frayed to the breaking point. She expected nothing from this polished Parisian priest. Then Father Claude began to speak. His voice was not the thundering boom of the fire and brimstone preachers she was used to. It was calm, reasoned, and suffused with a strange, penetrating warmth. He spoke of the love of God, not as a theological abstract, but as a personal, demanding reality. As he spoke, Margaret felt a physical jolt in her chest. The Friday wound began to throb, not with pain, but with recognition. It was a sensation of resonance, like a tuning fork vibrating when a specific note is struck. In the depths of her soul, the voice of Christ spoke clearly. "Behold, here is he whom I have sent to you." Margaret looked up, startled. She saw the priest at the pulpit, a man she had never met, and knew instantly that the siege was over. After the sermon, the sisters filed out, but the drama was just beginning. Father Claude, with his hunter's instinct, had sensed something in the chapel. As he distributed communion, he had looked at the faces of the nuns behind the grill. When he reached Margaret Mary, he had paused. He saw something in her eyes, a depth of suffering and a fire that frightened him. Later that afternoon, he met with Mother de Saumaise. He asked a question that stunned the superior. "Who is that young sister?" he asked. "The one who sat in the back?" Mother de Saumaise sighed, expecting a reprimand. "That is Sister Margaret Mary," she said, her voice tight. "She is a trial to us, Father. She's a poor soul, very beset, very complicated." "Bring her to me," Claude said. "Father, she is likely to waste your time with her fantasies," Saumaise warned. "Bring her to me," he repeated, his voice gentle but leaving no room for argument. The meeting took place in the convent parlor, separated by the iron grill that divided the cloistered nuns from the world. Margaret approached the screen with trepidation. She saw the silhouette of the Jesuit on the other side. She knelt, trembling. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she began, the standard formula. But this was not a standard confession. For the first time in years, Margaret opened the floodgates. She did not hold back. She told him everything, hiding nothing of the madness that plagued her. She laid out the chaotic, bloody, burning map of her soul and waited for the judgment. She waited for him to call her crazy. She waited for him to tell her to stop imagining things. Father Claude listened. He sat in the shadows, his chin resting on his hand, his sharp mind analyzing every word. He looked for the telltale signs of hysteria, the pride, the inconsistency, the desire for attention. He found none. Instead, he found a terrifying coherence. He found a humility that had survived systematic humiliation. He found a theology of the heart that was deeper than anything he had read in books. When she finished, there was a long silence. Margaret held her breath, gripping the iron bars of the grill until her knuckles turned white. "Sister," Claude said softly. "Yes, Father. You are not mad." The words hit her like a physical blow. She let out a sob, a ragged sound that had been trapped in her throat for 3 years. "You are not possessed," he continued, his voice firm and authoritative, "and you are not imagining this. The Spirit of God is upon you. His work in you is heavy, yes, but it is His work. You must trust Him, and you must trust me." In that moment, the isolation shattered. Margaret wept, not the polite tears of a nun, but the heaving, ugly sobs of a survivor who has finally reached the shore. Father Claude waited, letting her weep, offering her the dignity of his patience. He then did something extraordinary. He went to Mother de Saumaise and staked his reputation on the crazy nun. "Mother," he told the superior, "you have a saint in your house, and you are mishandling her." "But Father," Saumaise protested, "the visions, the irregularity." "The irregularity is God's business," Claude cut in. "Your business is to let her be. You are trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Stop testing her. Stop tormenting her. Let her follow the path He is laying out." The intervention of Father Claude de la Colombière was the turning point. The persecution did not vanish overnight. Old habits die hard, and the other sisters were still suspicious, but the institutional abuse stopped. Margaret had a champion. She had a spiritual director who understood the language of fire. Emboldened by this support, Margaret entered a new phase of her mystical life. The visions became grander, more theological, more urgent. And in June of 1675, during the octave of Corpus Christi, the great apparition occurred, the vision that would define the rest of her life and the future of the Catholic Church. Margaret was kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament. She felt the familiar pull, the dissolution of the room, the heat. Jesus appeared, but this time He was not alone. He stood on an altar of light, His heart blazing like a sun, the wound open and gushing blood and water. "Behold the heart which has so loved men that it has spared nothing," He declared, the words echoing with the finality of a judgment. "And in return, I receive from the greater part only ingratitude." He looked at Margaret. "I want you to establish a feast. On the Friday after the octave of Corpus Christi, I want a feast of the Sacred Heart. I want the church to stop and look at my love. I want reparation. I want communion of reparation." Margaret trembled. "Lord, who am I to do this? I am a nun in a cloister. I cannot speak to the Pope. I cannot speak to the bishops." Jesus pointed to the grill, to the place where Father Claude usually sat. "Turn to my servant, Father Claude," he said. "He is my perfect friend. He will help you. Together, you will do this." It was the commissioning of a divine alliance, the mystic and the theologian, the heart and the head. When Margaret relayed this message to Claude, the priest did not hesitate. He recognized the magnitude of the request. It was a call to shift the entire emotional axis of Christianity, away from the cold, fearful legalism of the time, Jansenism, and toward a theology of boundless, burning love. Claude consecrated himself to the Sacred Heart immediately. He began to preach it. He began to write about it. He became the amplifier for Margaret's silent signal. But just as the mission began to gain traction, just as Margaret began to feel safe, the shadow of the cross fell again. The divine madness required more fuel. The fire had to consume everything, even her only friend. In 1676, orders arrived from the Jesuit headquarters. Father Claude de la Colombière was being reassigned. He was being sent to England, a Protestant nation where being a Catholic priest was a crime punishable by death. He was to serve as the preacher to the Duchess of York. It was a prestigious post, but it was also a sentence to the lion's den. Margaret was devastated. The news felt like a physical amputation. She ran to the chapel, throwing herself before the tabernacle. "Lord, why? You gave him to me. You said he was my helper. Why take him now?" The answer she received was stark, a reminder that her vocation was one of solitary immolation. "I am sufficient for you, Margaret. Do you need a crutch, or do you need me?" It was a hard lesson. She had to let him go. The farewell between the two saints was brief and poignant. They spoke through the grill one last time. Claude promised to carry the message of the Sacred Heart to England. Margaret promised to suffer for his safety. They knew, with the intuition of souls that are linked, that they would never see each other in the flesh again. Claude left for England, walking into a political maelstrom of anti-Catholic hysteria. Margaret remained in Paris, facing the silence once more. But something had changed. She was no longer the frightened girl carving names into her skin. She was a woman who had been validated by a man of God. She had the proclamation. She had the mission. And she would need every ounce of that strength, because the devil, having failed to break her through bullying, was about to change tactics. If he couldn't destroy her with hatred, he would try to destroy her with fame. The final phase of her life was approaching. The secret of the Sacred Heart was about to leak out. The 12 promises were about to be codified. And Margaret Mary Alacoque, the hermit of the heart, was about to become the reluctant celebrity of a spiritual revolution. But before the glory, there would be one last crushing trial. A trial not of the body, but of the spirit. A darkness so deep it would make the Friday fevers feel like a gentle warmth. The dark night of the soul was descending, and this time there would be no Jesuit to hold her hand. Yet just as the darkness threatened to extinguish the mission entirely, a spark of rebellion was ignited in the most unlikely place, among the young novices who were preparing a coup of affection that would bring the convent to its knees. The departure of Father Claude de la Colombière in the autumn of 1676 left a silence in the convent of Paray-le-Monial that was heavier than the stone walls of the cloister. For Margaret Mary, it was a silence that tasted of iron. She had possessed a confidant for barely 18 months, a brief luminous window of time where she was understood, validated, and safe. Now, the window had slammed shut. Father Claude was riding north toward the gray, hostile fog of Protestant England, and she was left behind in the familiar cage of the Visitation, surrounded by sisters who still watched her, with eyes narrowed by suspicion. But this silence was different from the one that had suffocated her before. It was not the silence of the victim. It was the silence of the sentry. The great apparition had changed the texture of her suffering. She was no longer suffering merely for her own sanctification. She was suffering for a mission. She was the keeper of the Sacred Heart, the guardian of a nuclear secret that the world was not yet ready to receive. The years that followed Claude's departure were marked by a paradoxical existence. Externally, Margaret Mary remained the clumsy sister, the one who was often late, the one who broke dishes, the one who was humiliated in the refectory. But internally, she was operating on a plane of reality so intense that it threatened to burn her physical body to ash. The Friday fevers did not abate, they evolved. The pain in her side became a constant companion, a rhythmic throbbing that synchronized her life with the suffering of the unseen Christ. It was during this period that the leadership of the convent changed, a shift that would bring new trials and unexpected opportunities. Mother de Saumaise, who had moved from skepticism to cautious support, was replaced by Mother Greffier. Mother Greffier was a woman of terrifying rigor. She was not cruel, but she was exact. To her, sanctity was a mathematical equation. Obedience plus silence equals holiness. She viewed Margaret's visions not with hostility, but with a cold judicial skepticism. She was determined to ensure that this visionary was not enjoying her status. If Margaret Mary wanted to suffer for the Sacred Heart, Mother Greffier would ensure the suffering was authentic, stripped of any glamour or self-indulgence. Greffier's regime was one of calculated humiliation. She forbade Margaret from her long hours of adoration. She restricted her penances. She forced her to engage in the most mundane, distracting conversations during recreation, denying her the solitude she craved. When Margaret fell into ecstasy, Greffier would not allow the sisters to throw water. That was too dramatic. Instead, she would simply order Margaret, in a whisper, to return to duty. And Margaret, hearing the voice of authority through the fog of divine union, would instantly snap out of her trance and obey. This instant obedience impressed Greffier more than any miracle could have. A visionary who obeys is safe, she reasoned. A visionary who argues is the devil's plaything. And so, in a move that shocked the entire community, Mother Greffier made a decision that defied all logic. She appointed Sister Margaret Mary Alacoque, the clumsy, mad, controversial nun, as the assistant mistress of novices. It was a staggering promotion. The novitiate is the heart of a convent, the nursery where the next generation of nuns is formed. Placing Margaret there was like putting a pyromaniac in charge of a fireworks factory. The older nuns were scandalized. They whispered that Margaret would infect the young girls with her vapors, that she would teach them to be hysterical rather than holy. But Greffier knew what she was doing. She saw that while Margaret was incompetent with plates and brooms, she possessed a genius for the soul. She understood the language of love better than any theologian. Margaret entered the novitiate not as a tyrant, but as a mother. For the first time, she had an audience that had not been poisoned by years of gossip. The novices were young, impressionable, and hungry for something more than the dry legalism of the rule. They looked at Margaret and saw something the older nuns refused to see. They saw the glow. They saw the way her face transformed when she spoke of the Eucharist. They saw the quiet, burning intensity of her presence. It was here, in the secrecy of the novitiate, that the Holy Revolution began. Margaret could not officially preach the devotion to the Sacred Heart. It was not yet approved, and to do so would be disobedience. But she could not contain the fire. She began to teach the novices about the heart of love. She spoke of Jesus not as a distant judge, but as a wounded lover who begged for affection. She taught them that the essence of their vocation was not just to follow rules, but to comfort a God who was sorrowful. It was a radical shift in perspective. In the 17th century, religion was often driven by the fear of hell, a byproduct of the Jansenist heresy spreading through France. Margaret taught the logic of love. She began to introduce small subversive acts of devotion. She encouraged the novices to offer their small sacrifices, a cold meal, a biting word swallowed in silence, as acts of reparation to the heart of Jesus. She created a small secret altar in the novitiate. It was simple, a crude sketch of the heart she had seen in her visions, drawn with pen and ink on paper, surrounded by a few wildflowers. The novices were captivated. They began to rally around Margaret. They formed a little flock within the convent, a cell of fervent devotion that buzzed with a spiritual energy the rest of the house lacked. However, this underground movement could not stay hidden forever. The War of the Hearts was about to break out. The older sisters, the old guard, began to notice the change in the novices. They saw the young nuns making strange gestures, spending extra time in the chapel, whispering about the heart of Jesus. They smelled a rat. They accused Margaret of creating a cult, of introducing novelties that were not part of the visitation rule. The tension in the convent became palpable. It was a cold war fought in the corridors. On one side, the old guard, armed with tradition and suspicion. On the other, Margaret and her novices, armed with a burning fanatical love. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the other half of the divine partnership was undergoing his own martyrdom. Father Claude de la Colombière was living in the belly of the beast. London in 1678 was a dangerous place for a Catholic priest. The Popish plot, a fictitious conspiracy theory that claimed Catholics were planning to assassinate King Charles II, had whipped the populace into a frenzy of anti-Catholic hatred. Priests were being hunted, hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. Claude, serving as chaplain to the Duchess of York, was a high-profile target. He lived in the St. James's Palace, but he was surrounded by spies. Despite the danger, he did not stay silent. He preached the love of the Sacred Heart in the very capital of Protestantism. He wrote letters to Margaret, smuggled across the Channel, reassuring her that the mission was alive. But the net closed in. In November 1678, Claude was arrested. He was dragged from his bed in the middle of the night and thrown into the King's Bench prison. The conditions were horrific. The dungeon was damp, freezing, and infested with vermin. For a man with weak lungs, it was a slow death sentence. Back in Paray-le-Monial, Margaret Mary knew. She did not need a letter. The spiritual umbilical cord that connected her to Claude vibrated with his suffering. During her prayers, she felt the chill of the dungeon. She felt the weight of his chains. She told the novices to pray, not for his release, but for his fidelity. "He is on the cross," she whispered, her eyes dark with shared pain. "We must stay at the foot of it." Claude languished in prison for weeks, his health shattered by tuberculosis. He expected to die a martyr's death at Tyburn, a fate he almost coveted. But the politics of the time were complex. Because of his connection to the French King Louis XIV, he was not executed. Instead, he was banished. In 1679, a broken coughing skeleton of a man returned to France. Claude de la Colombière came home to die. He did not return immediately to Paris. He spent time in Lyon, trying to recover, but his lungs were destroyed. He was a living martyr, a man who had shed his health instead of his blood. Finally, in August 1681, he returned to Paray-le-Monial. The reunion between Margaret and Claude was not the dramatic, emotional scene a novelist might write. It was constrained by the grill, by obedience, and by the shadow of death. They saw each other only a few times. Claude was too weak to walk, Margaret was enclosed, but their souls touched. Claude confirmed to her that his suffering in England had been offered for her mission. He told her that the Sacred Heart would triumph, but only through the path of the cross. On February 15, 1682, Father Claude de la Colombière died. The news ripped through the community. The nuns mourned the loss of the brilliant Jesuit. They began to organize masses for his soul, praying for his release from purgatory. But Margaret Mary did something that scandalized them all over again. When the news was brought to her cell, she did not weep. She did not fall into a faint. She sat perfectly still, a strange, luminous peace settling over her features. Later, when Mother Greyfy asked her to pray for Father Claude's soul, Margaret shook her head. "He does not need our prayers," she said, her voice steady. "He is already in the presence of the Sacred Heart. He had no purgatory. His mission was his purgatory." To the other nuns, this was presumption. How dare she declare a man a saint before the church did? How dare she claim such intimate knowledge of the afterlife? It was seen as another symptom of her arrogance. They prayed for him anyway, pointedly, while Margaret knelt in silence, communing not with a dead priest, but with a living intercessor. But Claude had left behind a ticking time bomb. Before he died, Claude had kept a spiritual journal. In it, he had recorded his retreat notes, his inner struggles, and, crucially, his interactions with Sister Margaret Mary. He had written down the details of her visions, her sanctity, and the message of the Sacred Heart. After his death, his Jesuit brothers found these journals. Recognizing their spiritual depth, they decided to publish them as a book of spiritual retreats. They had no idea what they were unleashing. The book was published in 1684. It was meant to be a tribute to a holy Jesuit. But when the book reached the refectory of the Visitation Convent in Paray-le-Monial, it caused an explosion. The custom in the convent was to read spiritual books aloud during meals. One afternoon, the lector began reading from Father Claude's newly published journals. The nuns ate their soup in silence, listening to the pious reflections of the deceased priest. Then the lector reached a passage where Claude described a holy soul in the convent, a sister to whom Christ had revealed his heart. He described the burning chest, the exchange of hearts, the mission to the world. He did not name her, but he described her life, her suffering, and her humility with such precision that everyone in the room froze. Spoons stopped midair. Eyes darted around the room. They knew. Every nun in that refectory knew exactly who he was talking about. The clumsy sister, the one who ate rotten cheese, the one they had mocked, the one they had called mad. The supreme irony was that the highly respected, brilliant, saintly Father Claude was speaking of this mad woman with absolute reverence. He was calling her a chosen vessel of God. Margaret Mary, sitting at her table, kept her head bowed so low her nose almost touched the wood. She was mortified. Her secret was out. The anonymity she had clung to, the protective veil that allowed her to function, was ripped away. She was no longer just a nuisance. She was a public figure. The fallout was immediate and polarizing. For the novices and the little flock who supported her, this was vindication. "See," their eyes said, "we told you. The holy priest confirms it." But for the old guard, the opponents, this was an outrage. They felt betrayed. They felt that Claude had been duped by a manipulative hysteric. The atmosphere in the convent turned toxic. The resistance hardened. This brings us to the dark night of the soul, a psychological abyss that makes her previous physical sufferings look like child's play. We often think of sainthood as a steady climb toward the light, but for Margaret, the light vanished. Following the revelation of her secret, God withdrew his sensible presence. The vision stopped. The voice fell silent. The heat in her chest remained, but the consolation was gone. She was left with a terrifying emptiness. She began to doubt everything. Had she deceived Father Claude? Was she, as the older nun said, a fraud? Was the book a mistake? The devil, sensing her vulnerability, attacked with renewed fury. Margaret described this period as a time of precipice. She felt as though she were hanging over the edge of hell by a single thread. Voices whispered in her ear that she was damned, that her vanity had led her astray, that she had dragged the name of Jesus through the mud of her own ego. Physically, she began to deteriorate again. The burden of being the saint of the book was too heavy. Visitors began to come to the convent, asking to see the visionary. Margaret would hide. When forced to meet them, she would say, "I am nothing but a sink of iniquity." And she meant it. She felt like a hypocrite. Yet it was in this darkness that her true heroism emerged. It is easy to love God when He is holding your hand and burning your chest with fire. It is infinitely harder to love Him when He is silent, when the world is mocking you, and when your own mind is telling you that you are a failure. Margaret Mary kept walking. She kept the rule. She kept teaching the novices. She kept kneeling before the tabernacle, staring at a closed door, knocking with bloody knuckles, refusing to leave. She wrote during this time, "I have no friend but His heart, and I am content." It was a statement of defiance. She was doubling down on the wager. In 1685, a new ally emerged from the shadows, or rather, from the ranks of the opposition. Mother Grafey, whose term as superior was ending, did something unexpected before she stepped down. She had watched Margaret suffer the humiliation of the book reading. She had watched her endure the silence of God without complaining. And finally, the iron skepticism of Mother Grafey shattered. She signed a statement declaring her belief in Margaret's visions. Yet despite this victory, a final battle loomed. A new superior, Mother Meline, was elected, and under pressure from the old guard, the persecution resumed with fresh intensity. But this time, the counterattack would not come from Margaret, but from her spiritual daughters. The summer of 1685 descended upon Burgundy not with the gentle warmth of the vineyards, but with a suffocating heat that turned the stone cells of the Visitation Convent into kilns. Margaret Mary Alacoque lay in the infirmary, her body finally broken by the dual weight of the Friday fevers and the nuclear prayer she had uttered on the Feast of the Visitation. She had offered herself as a victim of immolation to break the hardness of the community's heart, a spiritual transaction that demanded a price in flesh and blood. She paid it in silence. For 40 days she hovered on the threshold of death, her breath shallow, her pulse an erratic flutter, her side burning with the invisible fire that no poultice could cool. But while the general lay fallen on the battlefield of the infirmary, her troops, the little flock of novices, began a guerrilla insurgency of love that would alter the course of history. The convent was in a state of spiritual civil war. The old guard, the faction of older nuns who viewed the Sacred Heart devotion as a dangerous novelty, held the levers of power. They controlled the liturgy, the schedule, and the public spaces. They believed they were protecting the order from heresy, from the emotional excesses that had plagued the church in the past century. To them, Margaret Mary was a contagion, and her illness was a convenient quarantine. If she died, the infection might die with her. However, they had underestimated the novices. These young women whom Margaret had trained not in the dry legalism of the rule, but in the fiery logic of the heart, were no longer children. They were disciples. Watching their mistress suffer, watching her wither away under the scorn of the community, ignited a fierce protective loyalty in them. They realized that the time for whispering in corners was over. If the devotion was to survive, it had to come out of the shadows. The revolt began with small subversive acts of piety. A novice would leave a sketch of the Sacred Heart on a window ledge where the older sisters would see it. Another would hum the hymns Margaret had composed while scrubbing the floor, the melody drifting through the silent corridors like a ghost. They were testing the perimeter, probing the defenses of the old guard. The tension came to a head on the eve of the feast of St. Margaret, July 20th, 1685. It was the name day of their beloved mistress, who was still bedridden. The novices decided to stage a coup of affection. Under the cover of night, conspiring in the dormitory with hushed voices and frantic hands, they constructed a makeshift altar. It was a masterpiece of poverty and love. They took a small table and draped it with their best linens. On it, they placed the pen and ink drawing of the Sacred Heart that Margaret had made, the image of the heart crowned with thorns and bleeding. They surrounded it with flowers stolen from the garden and candles scavenged from the sacristy. The next morning, the novices invited the community to see their handiwork. It was a calculated risk. By placing the image in a semi-public space, they were defying the tacit ban on the devotion. When the older sisters arrived, led by Mother Mellon, they stopped dead. They expected perhaps a simple greeting card or a bouquet. Instead, they were confronted with a shrine to the controversial symbol. The image of the heart stared back at them, raw and visceral. The candles flickered. The novices stood in a phalanx around the altar, their faces shining with defiance and joy, singing a hymn of reparation. The reaction of the old guard was immediate. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the group. One older sister, her face pinched with indignation, stepped forward to dismantle the altar, declaring it unauthorized. But then something shifted. Mother Mellon, the superior who had previously bowed to the pressure of the opposition, looked at the altar. She looked at the faces of the novices, faces that were not hysterical or rebellious, but radiant with a piety that the convent had not seen in years. She looked at the image of the heart, and for the first time she did not see a threat. She saw an invitation. Maybe it was the prayers of the dying Margaret in the infirmary. Maybe it was the sheer beauty of the novice's faith. But the hardness in Mother Maline's heart cracked. Instead of ordering the altar destroyed, she knelt. A gasp went through the room. The superior was kneeling before the Sacred Heart. One by one, the resistance crumbled. The nuns who had mocked Margaret, who had thrown water on her, who had ostracized her, felt the air go out of their anger. They dropped to their knees beside their superior. The rebellion had ended not with a purge, but with a surrender. The novices sang louder, their voices trembling with victory. News of this event traveled to the infirmary. When Margaret heard that the community had knelt before the heart, she wept. The victimhood she had offered had been accepted. The blockade was broken. From that day forward, the atmosphere in the convent underwent a thaw. It was not an immediate spring. There were still pockets of frost, sisters who held on to their grudges, but the institutional war was over. Margaret recovered from her illness, her work on earth not yet finished. She rose from her bed not as the pariah, but as the recognized spiritual power of the house. The year 1686 marked the consolidation of this victory. The devotion to the Sacred Heart began to move from a private secret to a public liturgy. On June 21st, 1686, the Friday after the octave of Corpus Christi, the specific date Christ had requested in the Great Apparition, the convent celebrated the Feast of the Sacred Heart for the first time, officially. It was a private affair, held within the cloister, but the symbolism was monumental. Imagine the scene. The chapel where Margaret had once been doused with holy water as a test for demons was now decorated with flowers in honor of her vision. The nuns who had forced her to eat rotten cheese now processed up the aisle, singing the praises of the heart she carried. Margaret knelt in her stall, her body vibrating with the Friday fever, but this time the pain was sweet. She saw her sisters, her tormentors, and her children united in the adoration of the love that had nearly killed her. But Margaret knew that a convent victory was not enough. Christ had said, "I will reign in spite of my enemies." He wanted the world, not just a building in Burgundy. The expansion began through the network of the Visitation Order. Margaret began to write letters, hundreds of them. She, who had once been forbidden to speak, became a prolific correspondent. She wrote to other convents, to Semur, to Dijon, to Moulins, spreading the fire through ink and paper. Her letters from this period are masterpieces of spiritual seduction. She did not argue theology. She simply transmitted the fire. She wrote of the furnace of love, of the ocean of mercy. She urged other Mother Superiors to embrace the devotion. And because the Visitation Order was a tightly knit family, the message spread like a contagion of grace. One by one, other convents began to adopt the practice. The heart was going viral in 17th century France. However, with visibility came a new form of torture for Margaret, the torture of fame. For a mystic whose entire spirituality was based on hiddenness and humility, becoming a celebrity was a special kind of hell. People began to talk about the Saint of Paris. Priests wrote to her asking for advice. Lay people wanted her prayers. Margaret hated it. She referred to herself as trash, as a dung heap of misery. This was not false modesty. It was the terrifying clarity of a soul standing next to the sun. She saw her own imperfections magnified by the light of God, and the praise of men felt like burning acid. The worst blow came from her former superior, Mother de Saumaise. Now stationed in Dijon, Saumaise was determined to preserve the history of the revelations. She realized that if Margaret died, the details of the visions would die with her. So, in a command that Margaret viewed as a betrayal, Saumaise, backed by Margaret's confessor, Father Roland, ordered her to write an autobiography. "You will write down everything," the order read, "every vision, every grace, every detail of your life, and you will not leave anything out." Margaret fought this order with the ferocity of a trapped animal. "Mother, please," she begged in her letters, "let me be forgotten. Let my secrets be buried in the grave. Do not force me to unveil the king's secrets to the world." To Margaret, writing her memoir felt like vanity. It felt like carving a monument to herself. But the vow of obedience, the very thing that had saved her during the rotten cheese incident, now bound her to this literary martyrdom. She sat in her cell, dipping her quill into the ink, her hand trembling. She had to relive it all: the paralysis, the blood oath, the scourging, the surgery of the heart, the humiliation, the loneliness. She wrote in agony. There are accounts that say she would write a few pages, then stop, overcome with nausea and shame, wanting to throw the papers into the fire. She would hold the pages over the candle flame, watching the edges brown, tempted to destroy the evidence of her singularities. But the voice of obedience held her hand back. She wrote a short, intense memoir, the autobiography of St. Margaret Mary, which remains one of the rawest, most unpolished, and powerful documents in Catholic mysticism. It is not the work of a scholar. It is the bleeding of a soul onto paper. She wrote it not for us, but because she was told to. She hoped it would be locked away in a trunk and never seen. She did not know she was writing the manual for a global movement. As she wrote, her physical health continued its slow, inexorable decline. The body that had been a cage, then a battlefield, was now becoming a ruin. The Friday fevers had burned through her reserves. She was skeletal, her eyes burning with a feverish light, her movements slow and painful. But as the body failed, the spirit expanded. By 1688, the devotion to the Sacred Heart had leapt the walls of the convents. The Jesuits, true to Father Claude's legacy, were preaching it in the cities. Images were being printed. The 12 Promises were circulating in pamphlets. Then, in 1689, came the final, most audacious command from the voice. It was a mission so grand, so impossible, that it makes the rest of her story look like a prelude. Margaret was in prayer when Jesus appeared to her, not as the sufferer, but as the King of Kings. He spoke of France, the eldest daughter of the Church. He told Margaret that he desired to be the true King of France, and that the earthly monarch, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was merely his lieutenant. The message was specific and political. Jesus demanded 4 things of the King of France: that the king consecrate himself to the Sacred Heart, that the king build a basilica in honor of the Sacred Heart, that the king paint the Sacred Heart on his standards, flags, and arms, that the king use his power to promote the devotion before the Holy See in Rome. Make this known to the eldest son of my Sacred Heart, Jesus commanded. Margaret Mary, the peasant nun of Burgundy, was being told to give orders to Louis XIV, the most powerful man on earth, the absolute monarch who lived in the gilded cage of Versailles. It was a suicide mission. How does a nun get a message to the king? Margaret wrote to Mother de Saumaise. She wrote to the Jesuit confessors at the court. She tried with the desperate energy of a dying woman to push this message up the chain of command. Tell the king, she wrote, that if he fights under the banner of the Sacred Heart, he will be victorious over all his enemies. But if he refuses, the warning was left unspoken, but the implication was clear. History tells us that the message likely reached the confessor of the king. Did it reach Louis XIV himself? We do not know for certain. But we know the result. The consecration was not done. The basilica was not built. The standard was not adopted. Louis XIV, basking in the glory of Versailles, had no time for the fevered dreams of a nun in the provinces. He was the Sun King. He needed no other light. Margaret felt the weight of this failure. She saw a dark shadow looming over the future of France. She predicted that if the king refused, a time of great misfortune would befall the House of Bourbon and the nation. Historical note, exactly 100 years later, in 1689, the French Revolution would begin. The monarchy would fall. Louis XVI, the descendant of the Sun King, would be imprisoned. In his final days in the Temple prison facing the guillotine, Louis XVI would finally make the vow to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. But it was too late. The prophecy of the nun had come true with terrifying precision. But in 1689, the revolution was a century away. For Margaret, the rejection by the king was simply one last cross to carry. It was the final proof that her kingdom was truly not of this world. As 1690 dawned, Margaret knew her time was up. She was 43 years old, but her body had the weariness of a centenarian. She began to prepare for the end. She told the novices, "I will not live through this year." They cried, protesting that she was relatively young, that the order needed her. She smiled, a smile of genuine relief. "I have suffered enough," she said. "It is time to go home." The community, now fully converted to her sanctity, was terrified of losing her. They began a campaign of prayer for her recovery. They stormed heaven, begging God to spare their saint. Margaret was horrified. "Stop praying for me," she scolded them gently. "You are keeping me here. You are delaying my union." In July 1690, she fell ill with a fever that the doctors could not diagnose. It was the Friday fever, finally unchained, consuming the last structural supports of her life. The doctor, a man named Dr. Billiet, looked at her wasting frame and admitted defeat. "There is no medicine for a fire that burns from the inside," he might have said. The convent became a place of vigil. The sisters, who had once shunned her, now fought for the privilege of sitting by her bedside. They dipped claws in cool water to wipe her brow, collecting the moisture as relics. They listened to her delirium, hoping to catch a final message from the beyond. Margaret, however, was done with messages. She lay in the infirmary, her eyes fixed on the crucifix on the wall. She was in constant, excruciating pain, but she refused opium or heavy sedatives. "I want to go to him awake," she whispered. October arrived. The leaves in the convent garden turned to gold and blood red, mirroring the colors of the heart she had served. On the evening of October 16th, 1690, the final crisis began. Margaret Mary asked for the last rites. The priest came. The community gathered, filling the infirmary with the soft murmur of the rosary. The candles flickered, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Margaret looked around the room. She saw the faces of the novices she had loved. She saw Mother Meline. She saw the faces of the sisters who had once been her enemies, now wet with tears. It was a tableau of victory. The love of the Sacred Heart had conquered the convent of Paray-le-Monial. She raised herself slightly on her pillows. Her breathing was ragged. She whispered one word, the name that she had carved into her chest, the name that had cost her everything and given her everything. Jesus. And then the Friday fever broke. The heat that had sustained her and tortured her for 17 years suddenly released her. Her head fell back. The burning stopped. Margaret Mary Alacoque was dead. But as the priest intoned the prayers for the dead and the sisters began the wail of mourning, a strange phenomenon occurred. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the death chamber lifted. The sisters later reported that a profound peace, a sense of immense, silent joy, filled the room. It was not the feeling of an end. It was the feeling of a door being kicked open. The saint of the burning heart had left the building, but she had left the fire behind. In the days that followed, the convent was besieged. The news of her death spread into the town of Paray. The people who had heard rumors of the holy nun flocked to the grill. They wanted to touch her coffin. They wanted miracles, and the miracles came: healings, conversions. The old guard sisters, now the keepers of her legacy, began to document everything. They opened the trunk in her cell and found the autobiography. They read the pages stained with her tears and realized, with a shock of awe, the true magnitude of what had happened in their midst. They realized that while they were worrying about cheese and dusty floors, a woman among them had been carrying the heartbeat of God. However, the death of Margaret Mary was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the prologue. The nuns of Paray-le-Monial buried her body beneath a simple slab, assuming the hysteria would fade with her. They were wrong. They had buried a seed, not a corpse, and the soil of 18th century France was the perfect fertilizer for a revolution of blood and fire. Margaret Mary had left behind a spiritual contagion, her autobiography and letters. Within months, these documents circulated in whispers from Lyon to Paris. In an era dominated by Jansenism, a heresy that preached a distant, judgmental God, the message of the Sacred Heart was a shock to the system. It spoke of a God who was not just a judge but a lover, a God who was vulnerable and craved human affection. The enemies of the Church fought back. Jansenists mocked the devotion as cardiolatry, calling Margaret a mental case whose visions were born of a starved brain. But the mockery backfired. The common people rallied to the God of the little people. Then came the plague of Marseille in 1720. As corpses piled up in the streets, Bishop Belsunce consecrated the city to the Sacred Heart in a desperate act of faith. The result was instantaneous and statistically impossible. The plague stopped. Suddenly, Margaret Mary was no longer just a crazy nun. She was the spiritual architect of survival. But the spirit of the age, the Enlightenment, was rising. Philosophers preached reason and cold logic, viewing the bleeding heart as a grotesque superstition. To destroy the devotion, political forces orchestrated the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, removing the heart's bodyguards. It seemed the age of reason had won, but the clock was ticking toward a divine deadline. Exactly 100 years after Margaret Mary delivered her ominous warning to Louis XIV, a warning the Sun King ignored, the bill came due. In 1789, the centenary arrived, the grace period expired, and the French Revolution exploded. King Louis XVI, the descendant of the Sun King, found himself stripped of power and imprisoned in the temple fortress. In the darkness of his cell, facing the collapse of his dynasty, Louis finally understood. He made a secret vow to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart if restored to the throne. It was too late. The timeline of heaven had run out. On January 21st, 1793, the guillotine blade fell, fulfilling Margaret's prophecy in blood. As the Reign of Terror began, a counter-revolution rose in the Vendée. Peasants fought the Republic not for a constitution, but for their faith. They sewed the image of the Sacred Heart onto their jackets and banners. For the first time, the heart of love became a badge of war. Though the Vendéens were crushed, their blood watered the seed. When the smoke of the Napoleonic Wars cleared, a traumatized France looked for healing. They realized that the Enlightenment promised a utopia of reason, but delivered a river of blood. Only the irrational, burning love of the Sacred Heart could heal the wound. The final fulfillment of the mission came in 1870. Amidst the Prussian siege of Paris, two wealthy laymen made a vow. If France survived, they would build a basilica. They kept their word. For 40 years, the white stones of the Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur rose on the hill of Montmartre. The king had refused to build it, so the pennies of the poor built it instead. It stands there today, a blinding white monument overlooking the city of secularism. Finally, in 1920, after the industrial slaughter of World War I, the Church needed a symbol of love more than ever. Pope Benedict XV officially canonized Margaret Mary Alacoque. The clumsy nun was raised to the altars of the universal church. Today, look around a traditional home and you will likely see that image, Jesus pointing to his burning, exposed heart. Before Margaret Mary, God was a distant watchmaker. She introduced the world to the vulnerability of God. She showed us a God who can be hurt, who desires us. We return to the cold chapel floor in 1673. When Margaret Mary claimed Jesus removed her heart and put it in a furnace, it cost her everything, her health, her reputation, her peace. Was it worth it? Her answer was found in the quiet surrender she whispered through the pain, confessing that while she feared all things from her own weakness, she hoped for absolutely everything from his goodness. That surrender was her victory. Margaret Mary Alacoque proved that the human heart is tougher than stone. She survived the paralysis, the cruelty, and the fire. In the end, her legacy proved one undeniable fact. Reason can build a city, but only love can save it. Saint Margaret Mary, pray for us. If you were moved by the story of Saint Margaret Mary and the fire that burned within her, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the raw, untold stories of history's most fascinating souls. Who should we profile next? Which historical figure, saint, sinner, or revolutionary, do you want to see analyzed in our next documentary? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep the fire burning.